Welcome to Whispers of the Night. This is Adam, your host for today's mystery. I'd love your feedback on these stories. What do you think I could do to make them even better? The pacing, the atmosphere, or perhaps the way the mysteries unfold? Please tell me in the comments. Your feedback truly helps shape what comes next for Whispers of the Night. If you enjoy this story, please give it a like and share it with fellow mystery lovers. Before we begin, tell me where you're tuning in from. Let me know in the comments. Now, pour yourself a cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. The Double Life of Professor Thistlewick. Chapter 1. The Scholar's Final Lesson. The November fog that settled over Cambridge that evening seemed to carry with it a weight of secrets, though I had no way of knowing this at the time. I stood beside Hercule Poirot on the steps of King's College, watching him adjust his overcoat with the meticulous care he brought to all things great and small. "Mon ami, Hastings," he said, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "It has been most gratifying, this visit to the university. The young minds, they are eager, yes, but they lack method. Order and method, these are the foundations of all understanding." Poirot had just completed his guest lecture on the psychology of memory to a hall packed with undergraduates and dons alike. The response had been enthusiastic, though I confess much of the psychological theory went quite over my head. Still, it was always a pleasure to see my old friend in his element, demonstrating the workings of those famous little grey cells to an appreciative audience. We were making our way toward the porter's lodge when a young man came hurrying through the mist, his academic gown billowing behind him like the wings of some great bird. "Mr. Poirot," he called breathlessly. "Thank goodness I've found you. I'm Dr. Colin Faraday from the Faculty of Classics. There's been, that is to say, we have need of your expertise." Poirot stopped and regarded the young man with interest. Doctor Faraday appeared to be in his early 32s with the pale complexion and slightly stooped shoulders common to those who spend their days bent over ancient texts. His dark hair was disheveled, and there was something in his grey eyes that spoke of genuine distress. "Abia, Dr. Faraday, you have the appearance of a man who has received disturbing news. Pray, what has occurred?" "It's Professor Thistlewick, Professor Archibald Thistlewick of Magdalen College. He's been found. Well, he appears to have died peacefully in his rooms this evening, but there are certain irregularities that the master thought you might wish to examine." I saw Poirot's eyes sharpen with interest. "Irregularities, you say? Of what nature?" Dr. Faraday glanced around nervously as if the very walls might be listening. "Perhaps it would be better if you came to see for yourself, sir. The police have been notified, but they seem inclined to treat it as a natural death. The master, however, knew of your presence in Cambridge and thought, maybe we shall come at once." Poirot was already moving, his characteristic quick steps carrying him through the college courtyard. "Tell me, this Professor Thistlewick, he was a man of what age?" 67, sir. "A scholar of ancient ethics and moral philosophy, much beloved by his students, though he could be eccentric in his ways." As we walked through the narrow lanes that connected the various colleges, Dr. Faraday provided us with the basic facts. Professor Thistlewick had been discovered at 8 by the college porter Jenkins during his evening rounds. The professor was seated in his favorite armchair beside the fireplace, a book open in his lap, apparently having passed away while reading. Mrs. Dawes, his housekeeper, had arrived shortly afterward when summoned. The college physician had been called and pronounced natural causes. A heart attack, most likely. "Then, what?" I asked. "Leads anyone to suspect otherwise?" Dr. Faraday hesitated. "It's difficult to explain, Captain Hastings. Nothing that would stand up in court, you understand. But Professor Thistlewick was, well, he was a man of very particular habits. Everything had to be just so, and there were certain details about the scene that seemed wrong. We had reached Magdalen College by this time, its medieval walls rising ghost-like through the fog. The porter directed us across a small courtyard to a staircase in the far corner. Professor Thistlewick's rooms were on the first floor, and even before we reached his door, I could see the warm glow of lamplight spilling from within. The sitting room was exactly what one might expect of a Cambridge dawn. Book-lined walls, comfortable but worn furniture, the lingering scent of pipe tobacco and old paper. Professor Thistlewick himself remained in his chair, a dignified figure even in death. He was a small, neat man with white hair and a carefully trimmed beard. His hands rested peacefully on an open volume of Marcus Aurelius, but it was not the deceased professor who first caught Poirot's attention. Instead, my friend's eyes went immediately to a small table beside the chair, where a delicate porcelain teacup sat on its saucer. "Voilà," Poirot murmured, bending to examine the cup without touching it. "Dr. Faraday, you mentioned irregularities. This cup, it is chipped, is it not?" "Yes, sir." Along the rim, Mrs. Dawes mentioned it particularly. She said the professor was absolutely fanatical about his tea service, Spo China, 18th century. He would never drink from a damaged cup. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of the room. He moved to the fireplace where the dying embers cast dancing shadows on the walls. "And here," he said, crouching before the grate, "we have the remains of correspondence, n'est pas? But what correspondence could be so sensitive as to require destruction?" I peered over his shoulder at the grey ash that filled the fireplace. Among the remains, I could just make out a fragment of what appeared to be an envelope, a corner bearing part of a foreign postmark. From abroad, it would seem, I observed, "Precissim Hastings." But from where, and why burn it? A letter of such importance that it must be destroyed immediately, yet not so urgent that one cannot finish one's tea first. It was then that a new voice interrupted our examination. "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but might I ask what you're doing here?" We turned to find a stern-faced woman of middle years standing in the doorway. She wore a dark coat and carried herself with the unmistakable authority of one accustomed to managing both a household and the man who dwelt within it. "You must be Mrs. Dawes," Poirot said courteously. "I am Hercule Poirot, and this is my friend, Captain Hastings. Dr. Faraday has requested that we examine the circumstances of your employer's death." "Mrs." Dawes's expression softened slightly, though she remained clearly shaken. "Oh, yes, I've heard of you, Mr. Poirot. Professor Thistlewick often spoke of your cases. He was quite an admirer of detective stories, you know, though he always said real crimes were much more mundane than fiction." "An interesting observation," Poirot replied. "Tell me, Mrs. Dawes, when you discovered the professor this evening, was everything exactly as we see it now?" "Well," Mrs. Dawes said, hesitantly, "I may have straightened things up a bit when I arrived. One does so automatically, you understand." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Straightened things up? In what manner?" "Mrs." Dawes looked uncomfortable. "Nothing significant, sir. Just tidying." "The teacup, for instance," Poirot pressed gently. "Was it in this exact position when you arrived?" "Aye. Well, I believe it may have been on the floor. Quite natural if the poor gentleman had a sudden turn. I simply placed it back where it belonged. And the window, it was open when you arrived." "Perhaps slightly, sir, though I can't be certain. Everything was rather distressing." Poirot absorbed this information thoughtfully, then moved to the window in question. It looked out onto a small courtyard, and there, clearly visible even in the dim light, was a bicycle leaning against the wall below. "Tia," Poirot murmured. "And whose bicycle might that be?" Mrs. Dawes joined him at the window. "Oh, that's Dr. Faraday's machine, sir. Though what it's doing there, I couldn't say. He usually keeps it in the college bicycle shed." I glanced at Dr. Faraday, who had been standing quietly near the door. His face showed surprise and, unless I was mistaken, a touch of alarm. "My bicycle, but I left it in the usual place this morning. I can't imagine how it came to be there." Poirot leaned forward, studying the bicycle more carefully. "The wheels, they are muddy, are they not? Yet the streets of Cambridge have been dry these past 2 days. Doctor," Faraday shifted uncomfortably, "there is the river path. Perhaps someone borrowed it for a ride along the Cam." "Peut-être," Poirot replied, though his tone suggested he found this explanation less than satisfactory. As I settled into my bed that night, listening to the bells of Cambridge chiming the hours, I could not shake the feeling that we had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple case of academic tragedy. The fog outside seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be revealed, and I found myself wondering what other surprises the morning would bring. Chapter 2. The Poet and the paradox. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the fog having lifted to reveal Cambridge in all its ancient splendor. After breakfast, Poirot and I made our way to Magdalen College, where we had arranged to meet with the master to discuss the previous evening's events. Dr. Theodore Whitmore, the master of Magdalen, was a distinguished gentleman in his 72nds, with the measured speech and thoughtful demeanor one might expect of a lifetime academic. He received us in his private study, a book-lined chamber that spoke of decades of scholarly pursuits. "Gentlemen," he began, settling behind his desk, "I must confess, I am deeply troubled by this business. Professor Thistlewick was not merely a colleague, but a dear friend. We studied together as undergraduates, nearly 50 years ago. Then you knew him well," Poirot observed. "Tell me, master, had you noticed any changes in the professor's behavior recently?" Dr. Whitmore considered the question carefully. "Now that you mention it, yes. Archie had become rather reclusive these past few months. He'd always been dedicated to his work, but lately he seemed almost obsessive about something, and there was a certain tension about him that was quite unlike his usual serene disposition. Did he confide in you about the nature of his current research?" "That's just it. He didn't. Most unusual for Archie. In the past, he was always eager to discuss his latest discoveries, his theories about ancient ethical systems, but recently, when I asked about his work, he would change the subject or give vague, evasive answers." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "And this Miss Trent, who visited him yesterday, what can you tell us about her?" "Ah, yes, Miss Marion Trent. She's a visiting fellow from Oxford, a poet and literary critic. Quite brilliant, actually, though her work tends toward the unconventional. She and Professor Thistlewick had developed something of a friendship based on their mutual interest in the intersection of literature and philosophy." "I should very much like to speak with Miss Trent," Poirot said. "Do you know where she might be found? She has rooms in the guest quarters. I can send word if you like." While we waited for Miss Trent to arrive, Poirot asked to examine Professor Thistlewick's office, which was located in another building across the college grounds. Dr. Whitmore led us through a series of courtyards to a modest brick building that housed the classics faculty. Professor Thistlewick's office was much like his private rooms, filled with books, papers, and the accumulated detritus of a scholarly life. But here the atmosphere was different. Where his private study had felt peaceful, almost contemplative, his office conveyed a sense of urgency of work left unfinished. "Regarde," Poirot said, indicating the professor's desk. "See how the papers are arranged, or rather, disarranged. This is not the desk of a man who has completed his day's work and gone home for tea. Indeed, the desk was covered with scattered notes, open books, and what appeared to be draft letters. Several sheets of paper had been crumpled and discarded, missing the wastebasket, and lying about the floor. He was composing something, I observed, something that required multiple attempts. Poirot picked up one of the crumpled papers and smoothed it out. "A letter, oui, but not in English. This is in French. And see here at the bottom, it is signed Felix Turner. Felix Turner, Doctor." Whitmore looked puzzled. "I've never heard Archie mention anyone by that name." "Perhaps," Poirot said thoughtfully, "because Felix Turner is not a person, but a pseudonym. See here." He indicated several other draft pages, all signed with the same name, all in French, all appearing to be academic articles or essays. I examined the papers more closely. The handwriting was unmistakably Professor Thistlewick's, but the content was unusual, sharp, critical pieces that seemed to be attacking various aspects of academic conduct and scholarship. "These appear to be rather harsh critiques," I said. "Accusations of plagiarism, falsified research, academic dishonesty. Not at all the sort of thing one would expect from Professor Thistlewick. On the contrary, Captain Hastings," Dr. Whitmore said slowly, "these are exactly the sort of things Archie would care deeply about. He was, above all else, a man of rigid moral principles. If he had discovered academic misconduct, it would have disturbed him greatly." It was at this moment that a soft knock came at the door, and Miss Marion Trent was announced. Miss Trent was a woman of perhaps 35, with striking auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She was dressed in a simple but elegant black dress, and her manner was composed despite the obvious strain of recent events. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, "I came as soon as I received your message, though I must say I'm not certain how I can help with what happened to Archie." Poirot rose courteously. "Miss Trent, I am Hercule Poirot, and this is my colleague, Captain Hastings. We are investigating the circumstances surrounding Professor Thistlewick's death." Miss Trent's composure flickered slightly. "Investigating? But surely it was natural causes. The poor dear man, simply his heart gave out." "Perhaps," Poirot replied gently, "but there are certain aspects of the case that puzzle me. I understand you visited the professor yesterday afternoon." "Yes, I did. We had arranged to discuss a paper I'm presenting next month on the moral philosophy of the Romantic poets." Miss Trent's voice was steady, but I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "And how did you find the professor?" "In good health, good spirits." Miss Trent hesitated. "He seemed troubled about something, distracted, not at all his usual self. Mrs. Dawes mentioned that there were raised voices during your visit. Might I ask what caused this disagreement?" For a moment, Miss Trent said nothing, her eyes moving from Poirot to Dr. Whitmore and back again. Finally, she seemed to reach some internal decision. "Very well, but what I'm about to tell you must be held in the strictest confidence, at least until you understand its full implications." She moved to the window, gazing out at the college grounds as if gathering her thoughts. Professor Thistlewick was not merely a scholar of ancient ethics. He was a practitioner of modern ethical journalism. For the past 2 years, he had been writing exposé articles under the pseudonym Felix Turner, revealing corruption and misconduct in academic institutions across Europe. The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. Montpoirot breathed. "And these articles, they were published where?" "In various academic journals on the continent and in some political periodicals." Archie was fluent in several languages, and he felt that publishing abroad would provide some protection from retaliation. "Retaliation?" Dr. Whitmore looked shocked. "But surely academic misconduct, when properly exposed, is simply a matter for institutional discipline." Miss Trent turned back to face us, her expression grave. "You would think so, wouldn't you?" But Archie's investigations had uncovered some rather serious matters: falsified archaeological data that had influenced government policy, plagiarized research that had resulted in significant grant funding, even one case where a professor had been selling advanced copies of examination papers to wealthy students. "And your role in this enterprise?" Poirot asked. "I helped him research and prepare the articles. My literary background was useful for developing the proper tone and style, and being a visitor from Oxford, I could move freely between institutions without arousing suspicion. But yesterday," Poirot pressed, "there was some disagreement between you." Miss Trent's composure finally cracked, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. Archie had discovered something particularly damaging about someone here at Cambridge. He was preparing what he called his final article, one that would, in his words, expose the most heinous academic fraud of our generation, and you argued against publication. I begged him not to publish it. The evidence was circumstantial, and the target of the article was someone with considerable influence. I feared for Archie's safety, and I told him so. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward in his chair. "Miss Trent, surely you don't mean to suggest that Professor Thistlewick's death was connected to these journalistic activities?" "I don't know what to think," Miss Trent replied, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. "All I know is that Archie was frightened. He said he had received threatening letters, warnings to cease his investigations. And yesterday, when I arrived for our meeting, he was in a state of near panic." Poirot absorbed this information with his characteristic stillness. The revelation of Professor Thistlewick's secret life as an academic crusader cast an entirely new light on his death. What had initially appeared to be the peaceful passing of an elderly scholar was beginning to look like something far more sinister. As we prepared to delve deeper into the professor's hidden world, I couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets lay buried beneath the gentile surface of Cambridge academic life. Chapter 3. The Bursar's Books. That afternoon, Poirot insisted we pay a visit to Mr. Pembember, the college bursar. I confess I was somewhat puzzled by this decision, as the financial officer seemed the least likely of our suspects to have been involved in Professor Thistlewick's death. However, Long experience had taught me to trust my friend's instincts, even when his reasoning was not immediately apparent. We found Mr. Pember in his office in the college's administrative building, a rather austere chamber filled with ledgers, filing cabinets, and the general atmosphere of methodical record-keeping. The man himself appeared even more nervous than he had the previous evening, constantly adjusting his spectacles and shuffling papers about his desk. "Mr. Poirot," he exclaimed upon seeing us. "What a surprise. I do hope you're making progress with this dreadful business. The whole college is quite unsettled, you know. Poor Professor Thistlewick. Such a shock." "Indeed," Poirot replied smoothly, "which is why I hoped you might assist us with some details regarding the professor's financial affairs. You mentioned yesterday that he had been drawing rather heavily on his research accounts." Mr. Pembember's face flushed slightly. "Well, yes, though I want to make it perfectly clear that there was nothing improper about the expenditures. The professor had every right to use his discretionary funds as he saw fit. Naturalmente, but the nature of these expenditures, they were unusual, quite unusual, actually. Large amounts for international postage, payments to foreign research services, subscriptions to continental publications, not at all the sort of expenses one would expect from a scholar of ancient philosophy." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "Research services of what nature?" Mr. Pember consulted a thick ledger on his desk. "Well, there were payments to something called Brussels Investigation Services, several large sums to various European libraries for document reproduction, and regular payments to what appears to be a translation service in Paris." "How large were these payments, if you don't mind my asking?" "Over the past 18 months, nearly £800, quite substantial for a professor's discretionary account." I whistled, softly, at the figure. £800 represented a considerable sum, far more than most academics would spend on routine research, and Professor Thistlewick offered no explanation for these expenditures. "That's what was so puzzling," Mr. Pember replied, removing his spectacles to clean them nervously. Archie had always been scrupulously careful about documentation, every expense properly receipted and explained, but these recent charges, he would simply submit the bills with a note saying research expenses and nothing more. "Did this concern you sufficiently to make official inquiries?" "Well, I did speak to the master about it. Dr. Whitmore assured me that if Professor Thistlewick said the expenses were legitimate, then they were. But from a bookkeeping standpoint, it was most irregular." Poirot absorbed this information thoughtfully. "Tell me, Mr. Pember, in your capacity as bursar, you must have knowledge of all the colleagues' financial affairs. Are you aware of any other faculty members who might have been engaging in unusual expenditures?" Mr. Pember's flush deepened. "I'm not certain I should discuss other faculty members' private financial matters. Oui. I understand your discretion, but surely if there were irregularities that might bear upon Professor Thistlewick's death—" "Well, Mr. Pember said reluctantly, "there was one matter that had been troubling me. Dr. Faraday. He's been living rather beyond his means lately. New bicycle, expensive clothing, frequent trips to London. His salary, while respectable, wouldn't normally support such expenditures. Has Dr. Faraday offered any explanation for this improved financial situation? He mentioned something about a family inheritance, but when I asked for documentation for our records, purely routine, you understand, he became quite evasive." Poirot and I exchanged glances. Another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. "One more question, if I may. Yesterday evening, when you visited Professor Thistlewick, did he seem to be expecting someone else?" "Now that you mention it, yes. He kept checking his pocket watch and glancing toward the window. When I asked if he was expecting a visitor, he said he had an important appointment later in the evening. Did he give any indication of the nature of this appointment?" Mr. Pember shook his head, only that it concerned a matter of justice that had been too long delayed. As we left the bursar's office, I found myself increasingly troubled by the picture that was emerging. "Poirot," I said, "it seems clear that Dr. Faraday had both motive and opportunity. He knew he was about to be exposed. He had access to the professor's rooms, and he was apparently in some financial difficulty that might have been resolved by stopping the investigation. Oui, mon ami, the case against Dr. Faraday appears compelling, But there are still aspects of this affair that trouble me, such as the timing. Hastings. If Professor Thistlewick was expecting an important visitor yesterday evening, and if that visitor was Dr. Faraday, then why was the professor drinking tea from a chipped cup? A man of his fidious nature would never serve an important guest with damaged china. Perhaps the chip occurred during their confrontation. Potre. But remember the fragment I found beneath his chair. It was a fresh break, not the old chip that Mrs. Dawes noticed. This suggests the cup was damaged after the professor's death, not before. I pondered this as we walked back toward our lodgings. The November afternoon was growing dark, and the gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life along the narrow streets. "There's something else that bothers me," I said. "If Dr. Faraday is our murderer, why did he summon us to investigate? Surely he would have been better served if the death had been accepted as natural causes." An excellent observation, Hastings, unless, of course, Dr. Faraday believed that by appearing to cooperate with the investigation, he could better control its direction. We had just reached the entrance to our inn when a young college servant approached us bearing a message. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but Dr. Faraday asked me to deliver this to Mr. Poirot with all urgency." Poirot opened the note and read it quickly, his expression growing grave. "What is it?" I asked. "Dr. Faraday requests an immediate meeting. He claims to have discovered new evidence regarding Professor Thistlewick's death, evidence that he says will surprise us greatly. Where does he wish to meet Professor Thistlewick's rooms at 8 this evening?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Poirot, surely this is a trap. If Dr. Faraday is indeed the murderer, why would we place ourselves at his mercy? Because Monger Hastings, sometimes one must take risks in order to reach the truth. But we shall not go unprepared. Poirot quickly scribbled a note of his own and handed it to the college servant. "Please deliver this to Dr. Whitmore immediately. Tell him it is a matter of the utmost urgency." As the servant hurried away, Poirot turned to me with a reassuring smile. "Do not concern yourself, my friend. By 8 this evening, Dr. Whitmore and several college officials will have received detailed instructions about what to do if we do not emerge from Professor Thistlewick's rooms within 1 hour of our appointment." The shadows lengthened as we prepared for what might prove to be a dangerous confrontation. Whatever Dr. Faraday had discovered, or claimed to have discovered, would soon be revealed. As I watched Poirot make his careful preparations, I couldn't help but wonder if we were walking into a carefully laid trap, or if the young lecturer genuinely held the key to solving the mystery of Professor Thistlewick's death. Chapter 4. The Hidden Truth. At precisely 5 minutes before 8, we made our way through the darkened college grounds toward Professor Thistlewick's staircase. The night was cold and clear, with a sharp wind that rattled the bare branches of the pot, ancient trees scattered throughout the courtyards. Our footsteps echoed off the cobblestones, creating an almost spectral accompaniment to our journey. Dr. Faraday was waiting for us at the entrance to the building, his face pale but determined in the lamplight. He appeared to have aged considerably since our first meeting, with dark circles beneath his eyes and a nervous tension in his movements that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting anxiety. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, thank you for coming. I know this must seem highly irregular, but I felt it was essential that we speak privately." "Certain," Mo replied courteously. "You mentioned new evidence." "Yes, but it's rather complex. Perhaps we should go upstairs where we can speak more comfortably." As we climbed the narrow staircase to Professor Thistlewick's rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a carefully prepared trap. But Poirot seemed entirely at ease, even pausing to examine a portrait of some long-dead college worthy that hung on the landing. Dr. Faraday unlocked the door to the professor's sitting room and ushered us inside. The room had been tidied since our last visit, but it still retained the melancholy atmosphere of a life suddenly ended. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across the book-lined walls, and the air held the faint scent of old paper and tobacco. "Now then, Doctor," Faraday said, closing the door behind us, "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here." "Indeed," Poirot replied, settling himself in the chair opposite the one where Professor Thistlewick had died. "You spoke of evidence." Dr. Faraday moved to the fireplace where he stood with his back to the dying embers. In the lamplight, his face looked haggarded, as if he had not slept for several nights. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket. "Mr. Poirot, I'm going to tell you something that may shock you. Professor Thistlewick was not the innocent victim he appeared to be. Vler, Mr. Poirot, for the past 2 years he had been systematically destroying the careers and reputations of various academics, not out of any noble desire for justice, but for personal revenge and financial gain." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly, but his voice remained calm. "These are serious accusations, Dr. Faraday. Do you have evidence to support them?" "I do indeed." "Doctor." Faraday reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope. "These are copies of correspondence between Professor Thistlewick and several of his victims. Letters demanding money in exchange for silence about alleged academic misconduct." He handed the envelope to Poirot, who examined its contents carefully. The papers rustled softly in the quiet room, as my friend studied each document with his characteristic thoroughness. After several minutes, he looked up with an expression of intense interest. "Most illuminating, Dr. Faraday. But I notice that all of these letters are addressed to institutions and individuals on the continent. Are you suggesting that Professor Thistlewick confined his blackmail activities to foreign academics?" "Not at all. I believe he was working up to targeting closer targets, people here in Cambridge who would be more vulnerable to his threats. People such as yourself, perhaps." Dr. Faraday's composure cracked slightly. "Yes, Mr. Poirot, such as myself." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. The weight of this revelation hung heavy in the air, transforming our understanding of the gentle scholar who had died in this very room. "Tell me, Dr. Faraday, what did Professor Thistlewick believe he had discovered about your academic career?" He had somehow obtained copies of my early research papers and was comparing them to similar work published in German journals. He was convinced that I had plagiarized my doctoral thesis. "And had you?" Dr. Faraday's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled upon them. "Yes, Mr. Poirot, I had. I was young, desperate to establish my career, and the German work was obscure enough that I thought it would never be discovered. So when Professor Thistlewick confronted you with this evidence, he demanded £500 for his silence, said that if I didn't pay, he would destroy my career, just as I had apparently destroyed that of his son." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "So you knew about James Thistlewick?" The professor made certain I knew. He told me in great detail how his son had died, how the shame of the false plagiarism charges had driven the young man to suicide. He said that justice demanded that I suffer the same fate. I felt a chill run down my spine as the full implications of Dr. Faraday's words sank in. "So, you killed him to prevent this exposure?" "No." "Doctor," Faraday exclaimed, his voice echoing off the book-lined walls. "That's just it. I didn't kill him. When I arrived for our appointment yesterday evening, Professor Thistlewick was already dead." Leaned forward with intense interest. "Already dead? Then why did you not summon help immediately?" "Because I panicked. I realized that if his death were investigated, his blackmail activities would come to light, and I would be ruined anyway. So I tried to make it appear that he had died peacefully of natural causes." "By doing what exactly?" I rearranged the scene slightly. The professor had apparently suffered his attack while standing by the window. He was crumpled on the floor when I found him. I moved him to his chair and tried to make it appear that he had died while reading, but I'm afraid I'm not very good at such deceptions. Hence the chipped teacup and the displaced bicycle, Poirot observed. Yes, I had left my bicycle below his window. I often do when visiting faculty members in that building, but in my panic, I forgot to move it. And the teacup, well, I'm afraid I dropped it while trying to tidy up. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his fingers steepled before him in his characteristic pose of concentration. A plausible story, Dr. Faraday, but it raises an obvious question. If you did not kill Professor Thistlewick, who did? I don't know, Mr. Poirot, but I suspect it was one of his other victims. The man had made many enemies with his blackmail activities at that moment. There was a soft knock at the door. Doctor, Faraday looked surprised, but Poirot seemed almost to have been expecting it. Entree, Poirot called. The door opened to reveal Miss Marion Trent, dressed in a dark coat and looking extremely agitated. Her usually composed demeanor had given way to obvious distress, and her hands clutched a small leather portfolio as if it contained something of vital importance. "Dr. Faraday," she said breathlessly. "Thank goodness I found you. I must speak with you immediately about—" She stopped suddenly as she noticed Poirot and me. "Oh, Mr. Poirot, I didn't realize you were here." "Miss Trent," Poirot said courteously. "How fortuitous." Dr. Faraday was just explaining to us his theory that Professor Thistlewick was a blackmailer. Perhaps you could shed some light on this allegation. Miss Trent's face went pale, and the portfolio slipped from her nerveless fingers, scattering papers across the carpet. As we all moved to help gather the scattered documents, I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be correspondence in Professor Thistlewick's familiar handwriting. The revelation of the professor's alleged blackmail activities had clearly shaken her to the core, and I wondered what other secrets this strange case would reveal before we reached its conclusion. Chapter 5. The Confession. Miss Trent's face went pale as she stared at the scattered papers on the carpet. Blackmail? But that's impossible. Archie was fighting against corruption, not engaging in it. "Peut-être," Poirot replied, bending to help gather the documents, "but Dr. Faraday has shown us correspondence that suggests otherwise." As we collected the papers from Miss Trent's portfolio, I noticed they appeared to be in Professor Thistlewick's handwriting, drafts of letters, notes, and what looked like fragments of a longer document. Miss Trent watched with growing distress as Poirot examined each sheet with his methodical attention to detail. "These can't be genuine," she said finally. "The handwriting is Archie's, but the content, this isn't the man I knew." "Nevertheless, Doctor," Faraday said, "they are real. Professor Thistlewick was not the noble crusader he pretended to be." Miss Trent shook her head emphatically. "No, there's something wrong here. Archie would never." She stopped suddenly, her eyes widening as if she had just realized something important. One particular document among those scattered had caught her attention, a folded sheet that appeared different from the others. "Mr. Poirot," she said urgently, "here's something I must tell you. Something I discovered this afternoon that changes everything." But before she could continue, the lights in the room suddenly went out, plunging us into complete darkness. In the confusion that followed, I heard the sound of running footsteps, a woman's cry of alarm, and what sounded like a heavy object falling to the floor. When the lights were restored a few moments later, someone had apparently tampered with the gas supply. We found Miss Trent unconscious on the carpet near the fireplace. Dr. Faraday was nowhere to be seen, and the envelope of alleged blackmail letters had vanished. Miss Trent regained consciousness within a few minutes, though she remained shaken and confused about what had transpired during those brief moments of darkness. "Did you see who attacked you?" I asked as I helped her to a chair. "No, it all happened so quickly. Someone grabbed me from behind, and then I felt a blow to my head. After that, nothing, until I woke up just now." Poirot had been examining the room carefully during this exchange. "Dr. Faraday appears to have departed rather hastily," he observed, "but he has left something behind." He indicated a small object on the floor, near where Miss Trent had fallen. A leather pocketbook that must have been dropped during the struggle. "This belongs to Dr. Faraday," Miss Trent confirmed. "I've seen him carrying it many times." Poirot opened the pocketbook and examined its contents with his characteristic thoroughness. "Most interesting, here we have a receipt from a Brussels chemist, dated 3 days ago. And this?" He held up a small glass vial. "This appears to be some form of medication." I examined the vial more closely. The label is in French, but it appears to be some sort of heart medicine, Precis Hastings. And if I am not mistaken, this vial contains a substance designed to mimic Professor Thistlewick's legitimate heart medication, but with very different effects. Miss Trent looked puzzled. "But why would Dr. Faraday have such a thing?" "An excellent question," Pooh replied. "Perhaps because he discovered it in the professor's rooms, and recognizing its significance, took it with him when he departed so hastily." Miss Trent, who had recovered her composure, despite the bandage now adorning her head, reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a thin folder that had somehow survived the evening's chaos. "After our conversation this morning, I decided to examine Archie's research more carefully. I went to his office and found this hidden in another of his secret compartments. She handed the folder to Poirot, who opened it and began reading with intense interest. As he progressed through the document, his expression grew increasingly grave. "May?" he breathed after a few moments. This is not what I expected at all." "What is it?" I asked impatiently. "It appears to be a detailed confession written by Professor Thistlewick himself. Listen to this. I can no longer bear the weight of what I have done. My quest for justice for my son has corrupted me beyond redemption. I have become the very thing I set out to destroy, a man who uses knowledge as a weapon against the innocent." Miss Trent nodded sadly. "There's more. Read the part about Dr. Faraday." Poirot continued reading aloud. "Young Faraday's plagiarism was real enough, but it was not the malicious theft I made it out to be. He was a struggling student who made a desperate mistake, and he has spent years trying to atone for it through dedicated scholarship and teaching. My son's death was tragic, but it was not Faraday's fault. The false accusations against James came from another source entirely." "Good Lord!" I exclaimed. "Then Professor Thistlewick knew that Dr. Faraday was innocent of causing his son's death." "It would appear so. But there is more." Poirot turned the page. "I have been blackmailing innocent people, using their minor indiscretions to fund my investigations into more serious crimes. I told myself I was serving justice, but I was merely serving my own desire for revenge. I can no longer live with this knowledge." The room fell silent as we contemplated the implications of this revelation. The gentle scholar we had thought we were investigating had indeed led a double life, but one far more complex and tragic than we had imagined. "Then the professor's death," I began, "was suicide." Miss Trent finished quietly. "That's what I realized this afternoon. Archie had been planning to take his own life out of guilt for what he had become." But Poirot was shaking his head slowly. "No, Miss Trent, I do not think Professor Thistlewick committed suicide. But the confession is genuine. But observe the date. It was written 3 weeks ago, not yesterday. And there is something else that troubles me greatly." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew the small fragment of porcelain he had discovered beneath Professor Thistlewick's chair on that first evening. "This piece of china tells us that the teacup was broken after the professor's death, not before. Someone came to his rooms yesterday evening, found him already dead, and then attempted to stage the scene to look like natural causes." Miss Trent looked confused. "But if Dr. Faraday found him already dead, and if the professor didn't commit suicide, then who?" Poirot's green eyes held that particular gleam that indicated his little grey cells were working at their highest capacity. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to arrange themselves into a coherent pattern, and I sensed that we were approaching the solution to this most complex of mysteries. Chapter 6. The Final Revelation. The following morning, Poirot insisted that we gather all the principal figures in this curious drama for what he termed a final clarification of the facts. Dr. Whitmore had arranged for us to use the college's ancient dining hall, a magnificent chamber with soaring Gothic arches and portraits of distinguished alumni gazing down from the panelled walls. By 10 we had assembled what remained of our cast of characters. Miss Trent sat at the long oak table, still pale from the previous evening's ordeal, but determined to see the matter through, to its conclusion. Mr. Pember occupied a chair near the windows, his ledgers and papers spread before him with characteristic precision. Mrs. Dawes had been summoned from her duties and sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the very picture of patient respectability. Notably absent was Dr. Faraday, who had vanished completely after the previous evening's confrontation. A search of his rooms had revealed that he had packed hastily and departed Cambridge sometime during the night. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, standing at the head of the table with his hands clasped behind his back, "we are gathered here to resolve the mystery surrounding the death of Professor Archibald Thistlewick. What began as an apparent case of natural causes has revealed itself to be something far more complex, a tale of deception, guilt, and ultimately justice delayed but not denied." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with interest. "You mean to say that Professor Thistlewick was indeed murdered?" "May we, master, but not in the manner we first suspected. and not by the person we initially believed guilty, began to pace slowly around the table, his green eyes taking in each face in turn. Let me first explain how I arrived at the truth. He paused beside the tall windows, where the morning light cast long shadows across the ancient stone floor. The professor's financial records showed payments to Brussels Investigation Services. When I examined what they had discovered for him, I learned they were researching the closure of the Beacon School for Boys in 1924, the school where his son James had been a student. The embezzlement that destroyed the school was committed by one Margaret Dawson, who vanished with the funds. Poirot's eyes fixed on Mrs. Dawes. Margaret Dawson. Mrs. Dawes. Simply reverse the names, assume a new identity, forge references, and begin again. The professor had discovered this connection, and yesterday evening he intended to confront the woman who had ultimately caused his son's destruction. Professor Thistlewick was indeed expecting a visitor that evening, someone with whom he intended to discuss a matter of great importance. But this visitor was not Dr. Faraday, as we first assumed. No, the professor's appointment was with someone much closer to home, someone who had been watching his activities with growing alarm. Miss Trent looked puzzled. But who? Archie never mentioned expecting anyone else. Ah, but he did, Miss Trent. Remember Mr. Pembember's testimony? The professor spoke of a matter of justice that had been too long delayed. He was preparing to confront Mrs. Dawes about her crimes, using the evidence he had gathered during his investigation. Poirot moved to stand behind Mrs. Dawes's chair. Mrs. Dawes, you've been very patient with our questions, but I fear the time has come for complete honesty. You knew about Professor Thistlewick's activities as Felix Turner, did you not? The housekeeper's composure remained unshaken, but there was a subtle weariness in her eyes now. I noticed the professor was writing. Yes, but I minded my own business, as a proper housekeeper should, and you also knew that his investigations had led him to discover something about your own past, something that could destroy the comfortable life you had built for yourself here at the college. Mrs. Dawes's hands tightened slightly in her lap, but her voice remained steady. I'm afraid I don't understand what you're suggesting, Mr. Poirot. Then, let me be more direct. Professor Thistlewick had discovered that you were not simply a loyal housekeeper, but a woman with a criminal past, someone who had embezzled funds from your previous employer and fled to Cambridge to start a new life. Mr. Pembe looked shocked. Mrs. Dawes, but that's impossible. Her references were impeccable. Precis replied, because they were forgeries created with considerable skill and attention to detail. Mrs. Dawes, if that is indeed her real name, had assumed a false identity to escape justice for her previous crimes. Mrs. Dawes finally spoke, her voice still calm, but with an underlying hardness that had not been there before. Even if what you say were true, Mr. Poirot, it would hardly constitute grounds for murder. Under normal circumstances, perhaps not. But Professor Thistlewick had discovered something else, that your embezzlement had not been a simple case of theft, but had contributed to the financial ruin of a small school for disadvantaged children. Several young lives were disrupted because of your actions. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an ancient clock on the mantelpiece. Mrs. Dawes sat perfectly still, but I noticed that her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her hands together. Furthermore, Poirot continued, the professor had learned that one of the children affected by your theft was a young man named James Thistlewick, his own son, who had been forced to leave his studies when the Beacon School closed. Without the proper education and credentials the school would have provided, James struggled to establish himself academically. This made him vulnerable to the false accusations of plagiarism that ultimately drove him to suicide. Miss Trent gasped. You mean Mrs. Dawes was responsible for the chain of events that led to James's death? Indeed, had the school not closed due to her embezzlement, James would have received the solid education and credentials that might have protected him from later academic persecution. Mrs. Dawes's crime created the circumstances that made James' eventual destruction possible. But how? I asked. How was the murder accomplished? Poirot reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew the small glass vial we had found in Dr. Faraday's dropped pocketbook. With this, Mrs. Dawes had access to Professor Thistlewick's heart medication. She prepared his tea each evening and would have known exactly which bottle contained his pills. She replaced his legitimate medicine with this substance that would trigger a fatal heart attack. But why was the vial in Dr. Faraday's possession? Dr. Whitmore asked. Because Master Mrs. Dawes made a crucial error. She left the empty vial of false medication in the professor's rooms, evidence of her crime. When Dr. Faraday arrived and found the professor dead, he discovered this vial among the medicine bottles. Recognizing its significance and fearing he would be blamed, he took it with him when he fled. Mrs. Dawes finally looked up, her eyes now cold and calculating. "You're very clever, Mr. Poirot, but can you prove any of this? May we?" "You see, you made several critical errors. First, you forgot that Professor Thistlewick was obsessive about his China service. He would never have used a chipped cup for an important meeting. The damage occurred when you dropped the cup in your haste to clear away the evidence of your presence. He moved to stand directly before her chair. Second, you attempted to burn the evidence when you realized the professor was dead, specifically the envelope containing your latest blackmail payment to him. But you failed to completely destroy it, and the Brussels postmark remained visible. Your connection to Brussels, where you had fled after your embezzlement years ago, made this particularly damning evidence. Third, in your panic after the murder, you borrowed Dr. Faraday's bicycle to quickly dispose of additional evidence along the river path, which is why it was muddy despite the dry streets. You returned it to outside the professor's window, not thinking it would be noticed. And fourth, he concluded, you carelessly left behind the empty vial that had contained the false medication you had obtained from your criminal contacts in Brussels, where you had fled years ago. Dr. Faraday found it in the professor's rooms, and fearing he would be implicated, took it with him when he fled, not realizing that by doing so, he was preserving the most crucial piece of evidence against you. Mrs. Dawes stood slowly, her mask of respectability finally slipping away completely. Professor Thistlewick was a foolish old man who should have minded his own business. I built a good life here, harm no one. He had no right to destroy that. Perhaps, Poirot replied quietly, but he had every right to seek justice for his son. As the college authorities took Mrs. Dawes into custody, I found myself reflecting on the tragic irony of the case. Professor Thistlewick's quest for justice had indeed led to his death, but not in the way any of us had expected. The truth, as Poirot often observed, was frequently stranger and more complex than any fiction could devise. Epilogue, justice, and redemption. 3 weeks later, Poirot and I found ourselves once again in the comfortable sitting room of our London flat, the Cambridge affair, having been resolved to the satisfaction of all concerned parties, save perhaps for the unfortunate Mrs. Dawes, who now awaited trial for the murder of Professor Thistlewick. The Morning Post had brought us a letter from Dr. Whitmore, updating us on the various consequences of our investigation. I was reading portions of it aloud to Poirot, who sat in his favorite chair, methodically arranging a small collection of books with the precision that characterized all his activities. The master writes that Dr. Faraday has returned to Cambridge. I reported apparently he came back of his own accord once news of Mrs. Dawes's arrest became public. He submitted his resignation from the college, though Dr. Whitmore seems inclined to refuse it. Trevor, Poirot murmured, adjusting the spine of a volume so that it aligned perfectly with its neighbors. Dr. Faraday is a man who made a youthful error, but has spent many years attempting to atone for it through honest scholarship. He deserves the opportunity to continue his work. The master also mentions that Miss Trent has been appointed to complete Professor Thistlewick's research on ancient ethics. She plans to publish his legitimate scholarly work while ensuring that his other activities remain private. Poirot nodded approvingly. Miss Trent possesses both the academic credentials and the moral judgment necessary for such a delicate task. Professor Thistlewick's legacy should be his scholarship, not his descent into vigilantism. I set the letter aside and reached for my teacup, pausing to examine it carefully, a habit I had developed since our Cambridge adventure. Poirot, there's something that still puzzles me about this case. May we, Mrs. Dawes? She seemed such a respectable, devoted housekeeper. How did you first suspect her involvement? Poirot ceased his book arranging and looked at me with those keen green eyes. It was the teacup, mon ami. From the very beginning, that chipped cup troubled me greatly. Professor Thistlewick was a man of rigid habits, obsessive about his possessions. Mrs. Dawes herself told us he would never drink from damaged china, but we thought the chip was old damage. Yeah, Null. Hastings. Remember the fragment I found beneath his chair? It was a fresh break, not the old chip Mrs. Dawes mentioned. This told me that someone had dropped the cup after the professor's death, not before. I nodded slowly. And since Dr. Faraday claimed he had found the professor already dead. Exactly. Someone else had been in those rooms between the time of death and Dr. Faraday's arrival. Someone who had access, who would not arouse suspicion, and who had reason to wish Professor Thistlewick dead. The muddy bicycle was another clue. Mrs. Dawes had used it to dispose of evidence along the river path, then carelessly left it where Dr. Faraday would be blamed for its presence. The Brussels connection was another clue, wasn't it? Prismo. Mrs. Dawes was evasive about the professor's activities, but her very defensiveness told me she knew more than she admitted. A truly innocent housekeeper would have been more forthcoming about her employer's unusual behavior. Her reluctance to discuss details suggested personal involvement. Poirot rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the busy London street below. But what sealed my suspicions was her behavior during our interviews. She was too controlled, too careful with her words, and when pressed about the professor's work, she claimed to mind her own business. Yet she had clearly been observing his activities closely, and the motive, the connection to Professor Thistlewick's son, that was revealed through the professor's own investigation. The Brussels investigation services he had hired provided me with their complete file on the Beacon School case. The records showed that James Thistlewick had been a scholarship student there when the institution collapsed due to embezzlement by its bursar, one Margaret Dawson, who disappeared with the school's endowment fund. Margaret Dawson, Mrs. Dawes. She had simply reversed her names and moved to Cambridge armed with forged references and a new identity. For years she lived quietly, avoiding detection. But Professor Thistlewick's investigation into his son's past eventually led him to discover the truth about what had really destroyed the boy's future. The Brussels connection worked both ways. He was investigating there while she still had contacts there from her criminal past. I shook my head in wonder. So the professor's quest for justice for his son ultimately led him to discover the woman whose crime had set James on the path to destruction. Indeed, and Mrs. Dawes, faced with exposure and ruin, chose murder rather than confession. She believed that by killing Professor Thistlewick, she could preserve her secret and continue her comfortable existence. But she hadn't counted on Dr. Faraday's panic making the death look suspicious, nor on Hercule Poirot being present to notice the inconsistencies. Poirot added with a slight smile. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, contemplating the strange turns of fate that had brought all these characters together in Cambridge. Finally, I spoke again. There's something rather sad about the whole affair, isn't there? Professor Thistlewick's noble intentions corrupted by grief and revenge. Dr. Faraday's career nearly destroyed by an old mistake. Mrs. Dawes living a lie for so many years. Sari Hastings. But there is also redemption in the story. Dr. Faraday has learned that honesty, though painful, is preferable to deception. Miss Trent will ensure that Professor Thistlewick's legitimate work continues to benefit scholarship, and Mrs. Dawes will finally face justice for her crimes. Poirot returned to his chair and picked up another book, examining its binding with characteristic attention to detail. The case reminds us that the past, however well buried, has a way of surfacing. Professor Thistlewick thought he was pursuing justice, but he was merely serving his own desire for revenge. Mrs. Dawes believed she could escape the consequences of her actions by creating a new identity. Both discovered that truth, like murder, will out. And what of justice? I asked. Has it truly been served? Poirot considered this question carefully before answering. Justice, mon ami, is a complex thing. Mrs. Dawes will stand trial for murder as she must. Dr. Faraday will face the consequences of his academic dishonesty, but he will also have the opportunity to rebuild his career on a foundation of truth. And Professor Thistlewick, though he cannot see it, has finally achieved the justice he sought for his son. He placed the last book in its proper position and surveyed his handiwork with satisfaction. Voila. Order and method. Hastings. In books, as in life, everything must be in its proper place. The truth about Professor Thistlewick's death is now known, and those responsible have been held accountable. That perhaps is the best justice we can hope for in this imperfect world. As evening fell over London, I found myself grateful once again for my friendship with Hercule. His remarkable mind had unraveled the complex web of deception surrounding Professor Thistlewick's death, bringing light to dark corners and ensuring that justice, however delayed, was finally served. The case of the double life of Professor Thistlewick had reached its conclusion, and with it another chapter in the remarkable career of the world's greatest detective. Thank you for listening to the double life of Professor Thistlewick. Here on Whispers of the Night, Poirot reminds us that even in the halls of learning, the greatest lessons are often written in guilt, ambition, and the quiet price of truth. If you enjoyed this mystery, please subscribe for more detective tales and share it with fellow lovers of intrigue. If you want to further support the channel, you can join our membership for ad-free episodes. The link is in the description. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Adam signing off from Whispers of the Night.